Accounting firm Deloitte Canada is helping to amplify the voices of Indigenous youth. It hopes that government and industry will read its newly released report and fight climate change to one day achieve environmental reconciliation. Joining me today to talk more about it is Mitch Mercurdy, Director of Nation Building Advisory at Deloitte Canada. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Mercurdy. Can you first tell our viewers how much Indigenous communities are being impacted by flooding compared to non-Indigenous communities in Canada?
Indigenous communities throughout Canada, studies have shown that Indigenous peoples living on reserve are 18 times more likely than other Canadians to be evacuated due to climate emergencies and disaster. 81% of First Nations lands are exposed to flooding, and 40 to 41 locations are at highest risk of flood hazards based on flood exposure and social vulnerability measures.
Can you explain what that does to Indigenous youth when they're being displaced all the time and evacuated due to flooding?
A lot of it can play on their social well-being, their mental health, having to move. I know my community of Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, last year due to wildfires, they had to be removed from the community, and they all lived in Fort McMurray. And I myself, coming from Fort McMurray originally, in the 2016 fires, we had to be displaced as well for a couple months. So it wasn't very good, but at the same time, what we noticed is family came together. You know, like during distress like that, we come together. But at the same time, it's getting out of the norms that you kind of have to, like the youth experienced. I'm not too sure what they would have experienced. I know there was a lot of fear with the fires, a lot of fear of their house burning. And that's just a fire. Floods are totally different as well, where floods can be, their house could be washed down. Like in British Columbia, they had major floods, and a lot of First Nations were affected as well.
Yeah. What, in this report, what are some of the main recommendations that stood out for you?
One of the big recommendations that stood out to me was, respect for Indigenous traditional knowledge and the connections to lands. So implement Indigenous language and cultural revitalization efforts. A lot of our youth spoke out how our languages are being lost. Invest in Indigenous-led land-based language learning and cultural camps, such as medicine walks, hunting, harvesting, fishing methods, storytelling, forest renewal practices, design public urban spaces for land-based activities, incorporate local Indigenous knowledge and perspectives in community planning and urban design, especially for our urban folks. A lot of the youth, they don't have that connection to the land, same as someone living on the reserve or the Métis settlement or up in the north in their community. They have that connection, but as soon as you take them out of the land, they don't have that. So we need to start working with schools. A good example would be the Fort McMurray Public School Division, where they are working with the schools, where they are taking both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and taking them out on the land and teaching them from our local elders, harvesters, trappers, talking about the lands, medicines, and why it's important to keep them healthy. And then you get that whole reciprocity of why it's important to care for them. And it's not just Indigenous kids, but it's all.
Yeah. What, finally, really briefly here, what do you hope stakeholders and governments take away from this report?
Really, part of this whole report was to spark an interest. This report was meant to inspire decision makers to examine the progress of their reconciliation efforts. That accounts for the experience of young Indigenous people and to ensure their efforts have meaningful, positive impacts for Indigenous people. Our youth were very frank with us and said that we want to be heard, and we want to make a loud bang that we need to be heard. We need to be at those tables. When we look at the next 7 generations, and this is how they're already thinking, is the impacts to our environment, they're already thinking the 7 generations, and that's why they need to be heard. They need to be at those tables. Not just the youth, but also our Indigenous people need to be at those tables and making some of those decisions with corporate Canada.
Yeah. Well, thank you for speaking with us today, Mr. McCurdy.
Thank you. Merci, Cho.